Welcome to the third Ethanol Speaker Series. Good morning, good evening, and good night. Today we will be discussing biofuels, net zero, and India. Before we get started, let me just go through a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen are multiple application widgets you can see. All the widgets are resizable and movable. The audio will stream through your computer speakers and headphones, so please make sure that your computer speakers and headphones are turned on and your console is unmuted. Use the sound button found on the lower right-hand corner of your screen to adjust your volume. If you encounter any issues during the broadcast, please try and refresh your browser and close any other applications that may be using the internet to conserve bandwidth. Chrome and Firefox web browsers are recommended. Questions can be asked at any time through the Q&A window on your screen. We will be monitoring questions throughout the session and answering these live at the end. An on-demand version of the webcast will be available approximately a day after the webcast and can be accessed using the same link that was sent to you. So tonight's topic picks up where we left off from our first series 2 months ago, and that is the role of biofuels in the energy transition discussion. After COP26, we have seen a surge in global commitments and pledges around achieving net zero, and that is fantastic. However, we need to figure out how to do this, what type of pathways can be pursued and leveraged to their full potential, and most importantly, what is the outlook for biofuels into the future? Specifically, what is the outlook for India? As India embarks on its own energy transition and ethanol takes center stage to achieve E20 by 2025, it is more critical than ever before that we keep the focus on the contributions of ethanol into energy transition and the industry. So with that, please let me introduce our guest tonight. We will be hearing from Jeremy Moorhouse, who is a bioenergy analyst at the International Energy Agency, or IEA. He joined the IEA in November 2020, and he is responsible for developing the IEA's midterm biofuels and bioenergy forecast and contributes to bioenergy-related work across the agency. He has 15 years of experience developing program strategies and objectives, analyzing energy systems, managing teams, and collaborating with industry and governments to develop climate and renewable energy policy. He holds a Master's of Resource and Environmental Management from Simon Fraser University. Please join me in welcoming Jeremy. Jeremy, take it away.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm just going to share my screen. 1 second. Let me see if we can, here we go. So I've got my screen up now. So what I'd like to cover today, I'm going to look at biofuels in the context of net zero, and then also I'm actually going to start with COP26. We'll look at COP26 first, and some of the outcomes from COP26 and what this means for liquid biofuels. I'm then going to move on to some work that the IEA has done on net zero pathways, and then the role that biofuels can play within net zero. So that'll be looking out into the future, out to 2050. I'm then going to ground that in some of the work that we've done for our Renewables 2021 report, which just came out last week, which looks at the status of biofuels today and what exists in terms of policy and projects out to 2026. And finally, I'll dive a little bit deeper into what the prospects look like for India, especially what are the keys to success in helping to achieve that 20% blending target by 2025. Now, looking at COP26, there is a lot of material out there on what was successful or not at COP26. I think a high-level takeaway is that it leaves the door open to 1.5 degrees, but that the commitments that were made during COP26 don't get us there yet. But what I want to pull out here is there are a few points that came out of COP26 that I think have particular relevance when we're thinking about liquid biofuels. One of them are just the country level commitments. So we see now about 90% of the economy, countries that represent 90% of the economy have committed to reduce emissions to net zero, and that's up from 30% in 2020. So there's a a lot of agreement on this target of net zero. And you'll see a bit later on that target shows a lot of potential for biofuels. But the actions that we need to achieve net zero aren't there yet. So there's a bit of a gap between the target and then the actions that we need to achieve that target. There's some other elements as well that were discussed at COP26. There's the Glasgow Declaration and the Glasgow Breakthrough. Both focus on sustainable agriculture, sustainable land use. That links to biofuels by the way that the products that are made that are used to then produce biofuels, the conditions around those. There's also the International Aviation Climate Ambition Coalition, which is committed to increasing the use of sustainable aviation fuels. And you'll see a little bit later on that ethanol and biofuels can contribute to that through biojet, which can be blended with aviation fuels. And then finally, there's the Integrated Biorefineries Mission, which was co-launched by India and the Netherlands, which looks to accelerate the deployment of biorefineries around the world. We're still waiting for more details on that particular project, but it was announced at COP26. So that's a bit of the high-level context around COP26. But this 1.5 degree trajectory matches with a net zero trajectory. And the IEA spent quite a bit of time at looking at how do we actually get on a path to net zero? And what does that mean for our energy systems? And the outcome for a world that's on a path to net zero is a very significant change in the amount of energy we use, thanks to energy efficiency, and also the types of energies that we use. And so renewable energy plays an ever increasing role as natural gas, oil, and coal use start to decline over time. There's a lot of detail in this graph. I'll just draw your attention to these green wedges. So this is the role that bioenergy can play. And out to 2050, sustainable bioenergy provides around 20% of total global energy supply. Now, I've used the word sustainable bioenergy very intentionally there. In this work that the IEA has done, we've taken into consideration things like competition for land and competition with food resources. So this supply protects land use, it also protects food supplies while also growing bioenergy use. And we end up with about 100 exajoules of total bioenergy use within that framework. Now, digging a bit deeper specifically on the biofuel pathway, this is an interesting graph that shows all the different types of fuels and how they grow over time. If we look at conventional ethanol, so this is how most ethanol is made today from starches and sugars, we see a bit of growth out to 2030, but then a bit of decline to 2040 and 2050. Now, part of that is because it's not necessarily a decline in conventional ethanol itself, but just how we produce it today. In the future, to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions on a net zero path, increasingly those facilities need to be combined with carbon capture and storage to really enhance the greenhouse gas benefit that we get from ethanol. But we still see this decline again out to 2040 and 2050. And this is where those sustainability metrics start to kick in, where there's room to grow conventional production. But if we can develop those advanced fuels, so those would be fuels that come from different feedstocks than we primarily use today, ethanol demand would double out to 2030. It would still be higher in 2040 and about the same total production as today. And one of the questions that comes up when we share this graph is, so what happens after 2030? Like, we're not going to build a huge build out of ethanol plants just to shut them down 10 years later. And the answer lies in this purple segment here. So this is a mix of advanced biodiesel and also biokerosene. Biokerosene, also known as biojet, can be blended with aviation fuels. So ethanol has a path there as well. So past 2030 into 2040, we see electric vehicles really start to provide the majority of road transport. And so gasoline demand starts to decline. And so a lot of ethanol plants are then repurposed to produce biojet through the alcohol to jet pathway. So ethanol, we see it double in demand over the next decade, but increasingly adding carbon capture and storage and developing new feedstocks. And then as we move out to 2040 and 2050, some of that ethanol is then being used to produce biojet. Now, another question is, okay, so this is the net zero pathway. Are we actually on that pathway today? And unfortunately, the answer is no. When we look at our main case, we see considerable growth from 2020, about 25% growth out to 2026. If we look at an accelerated case where we take the policies that are under consideration today, we take the projects that have been announced but don't necessarily have a final investment decision, that grows further. But we're still well off target from this net zero scenario. And we're off target in total volumes, which is what I'm showing here, but we're also off target in terms of the projects that plan to incorporate carbon capture and storage or plan to use a different set of feedstocks. So we need a lot more growth in these industries and specifically for certain types of fuels. So I've gone over global context with COP, net zero pathways and the way biofuels can fit within that and where we are. Now I'm going to bring us to the present day out to 2026 through our biofuels outlook, which is part of the Renewables 2021 report, which we just released last week. So this is fresh information that I'm sharing with you today. So the first point is that biofuels recovered in 2021 and there's some growth out to 2026. Now, back in 2020, because of mobility restrictions related to COVID-19, we saw a significant decline in biofuels demand, and that's because gasoline and diesel demand declined. And so the biofuels that are blended with those fuels went down as well. But as we come into 2021, mobility restrictions have eased. We're still dealing with a lot of the COVID impacts, but people are moving around more, so gasoline and diesel has started to climb up. And policies have gotten stronger in a number of places in the world. So we see a full recovery in biofuels demand in 2021. But growth isn't as high as we would have expected because we're also seeing very high commodity prices. And I imagine everyone who's attending this webinar has experienced higher prices for some of the things that they're purchasing. And the same thing is happening in the biofuels world. Prices have gone up 70% to 150%. Depending on which fuel and which region we're looking at. For the most part, governments have kept policies in place or accelerating them, like in India. But in 4 countries, Argentina, Colombia, Brazil, and Indonesia, those governments have reduced or delayed increasing mandates in response to these high prices. In total, that's brought our demand forecast down by 5 billion liters, so that red piece at the top of the 2021 chart. Now, we expect that those price impacts will be temporary. They're not primarily related to biofuels demand. They have to do with shipping constraints and other impacts in the agricultural sector. And we also expect those policy changes that a few governments have made to be temporary. And so growth out to 2026 is about 20% growth if we look at the existing set of policies that are being planned and the projects that are being proposed. This growth is spread around the different regions in the world. We see a lot of growth in Asia, primarily because of India and Indonesia. In Europe, we see a bit of a mix. There's stronger policies, but also declining gasoline and diesel demand. So we don't see as much growth as we might otherwise think. In Latin America, this is primarily Brazil. And then in North America, it's the mix of Canada's clean fuel standard and then existing policies in the United States. Now we take that growth and then look at, well, where is that growth happening in terms of fuels? So which fuels grow the most? So renewable diesel and ethanol take the majority of this growth, with ethanol leading. So it's a big blue bar. Now, some of that growth is actually just recovering from the 2020 impact. So it's not all new growth, but a lot of that is new growth in demand. Biodiesel grows a bit as well. We also see renewable diesel grow considerably, especially in the United States. And then, in volume terms, a small increase in biojet, but it's starting from a very small number. So that's about a 10 times growth in biojet from what we see today. Another piece that's important in this graph, I'll draw your attention to these black and red diamonds. So while ethanol is growing the most, its share actually declines over this time period because biodiesel, renewable diesel, and biojet combined grow so much. So ethanol is growing, but its share of total biofuel use is actually declining over this time period. Another way to look at this is to take, well, where's that ethanol growing? Which regions in the world? And this is an interesting result from our work, that policies and the context within specific countries are really driving where these fuels grow. So that ethanol growth that was on the previous graph, a lot of that is happening in Brazil and then in Asia. In Asia, that's primarily India's pursuit of its 20% blending target. And then Brazil, part of that's recovery, and another part of it comes from Brazil's existing suite of policies for ethanol, mandates, consumer purchases, and then also its Renova Bia program. Now, in both of these regions as well, we see increasing gasoline demand. So that kind of enhances those policy signals, because not only do you have the blending targets increasing, but you also have total fuel demand increasing. So we end up with this much larger growth in those two areas. If you then look at the United States and Europe, we have a different trend. Gasoline demand is actually declining out to 2026 because of efficiency measures for vehicles, and then also electric vehicles starting to grow. And in the United States, blending stays near the same in this forecast, and so total demand actually starts to decline in the US. In Europe, we see a bit of growth thanks to strengthening policies, but that's just able to counteract that decline in gasoline demand. So it's only a very small amount of growth. But what we see instead in those regions, about 97% of all the interest in renewable diesel is going to the United States and Europe. And that's in part because renewable diesel can be blended at higher rates with diesel. In California, for example, they're up to 30% blending in diesel, and that's happening because renewable diesel can be blended at higher rates. It does well on greenhouse gas metrics as well, and it can be produced from waste. So that earlier slide when I was looking at net zero, those advanced pathways, some of these fuels can be produced from waste as well. And so they do better in places where there's policies that require certain feedstocks to be used. Now, I said that India was responsible for most of that ethanol growth, and the growth in India is, it's fantastic to see. It's a very large amount of growth, and India is now on track to become the third largest ethanol consumer. So we'll do a little time segment here. In 2015, India was seventh largest consumer. Production levels were pretty low. But as we climb to 2020 and then 21, we see a real significant increase in the production and use of ethanol in India. And that's thanks to a whole suite of policies helping to produce new plants, providing pricing for ethanol. And those types of policies have really helped to drive that growth. As we continue into the future, if it hits 10% blending by 2022, it's just behind China. But by 2023, it comes into third position. And by 2026, India's the third largest consumer of ethanol in the world. Now, I haven't put the top two consumers because United States and Brazil, they are very big consumers of ethanol. And so India's in third place, but not yet challenging Brazil for the number 2 spot. Now, what I've shown you to date is what we call our main case. So this is taking a best assessment of the existing set of policies that countries have committed to or are very likely to come into place, and looking at the projects that are planned as well to see if we have the right amount of capacity to produce ethanol. We also look at something called the accelerated case. So this is if policies that are under discussion actually get put into place. And in this scenario, we see total growth in biofuels double from the main case. And most of that growth goes to ethanol. And what's driving that growth is a handful of policies in the United States, in the European Union, India, and China. And so when I go through ethanol, I'll go through each of those policy sets. So for Asia, this is really India, depending if it achieves that 20% target in 2025, and then in China, depending how it decides to peak emissions before 2030. In the United States, this is a question around what happens to the renewable fuel standard post 2022 and whether the United States is able to push back 10% blending across the country. There's a bit of growth in Europe as well, and then a bit of growth in Brazil. Brazil is such a huge consumer that even small changes can lead to a fairly significant increase in demand. And then the rest of the world. I'll go through some of the other ones quickly. We see growth in these other fuels as well. But one of the main points is just that ethanol has a lot of upside potential based on the policies that are under discussion right now in different countries. So in this accelerated case, India achieves its 20% blending target by 2025. And so the next set of slides, I want to look at what does that mean for India and what are the keys to success for actually getting to that 20% target. So we're going to look at here is the demand, which is that red line, versus the capacity that's available. So in 2021, India is comfortably within the capacity that it can produce within the country to produce ethanol. But even as we start to get out to 2022, new capacity is going to have to come online well beyond existing capacity plus capacity that's already planned. So those are projects that are already being built or are going to go forward. And as we climb out to 2026, that gap continues to grow. All told, capacity has to more than double to 2026. And thinking of it another way, it's got to expand by 25% every year out until 2025. And it even needs to continue expanding post 2025, because even if it stayed at 20% blending, gasoline demand is increasing. So every year there's additional demand for ethanol to stay at that 20% blending point. So capacity has to expand. That's one of the key conditions. And India is helping to facilitate that with some of the policies that are in place right now. There's other elements too that will need to come into place in order to achieve that 20% target. Fleet compatibility is a big one, and what I mean by that is the ability for vehicles to use 20% ethanol blends. Greenhouse gas and sustainability frameworks can also support that growth by providing those guardrails to ensure that the growth is happening in a way that produces the most benefits. Stable feedstock supply, as well as ongoing policy support, are also going to be needed. I'm going to go into each of these in a little bit more detail. Now, the vehicle fleet point, I actually learned a lot about this on the last U.S. Grain Council's presentation with the Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers and NREL from the U.S. There's a lot of detail. If you haven't seen that one, you can refer back to it. There's several reports there that will go far more into detail in this discussion than I'm going to right now. But the issue is this. Based on what we understand right now, the vehicle fleet in India, a lot of vehicles are limited to 10% ethanol content in the fuels. And in order to get to 20%, that would need to change. Now, there's a study right now, from what I understand, that's looking at this with India to really understand in detail which vehicles could handle higher blends and which ones can't. So that will help understand just where that limit may lie. There's other options for getting past this limit. Brazil is a good example. Average blending in Brazil is now at higher than 50%. And so Brazil's found a way to get past that 10% line. Retrofits are an option for some vehicles, although the scale of that in India may make it difficult. New vehicles can be flex fuel vehicles, which means they can run on different levels of ethanol and gasoline blends, or other vehicles that are produced with the intention of using 20% blends. So there's a number of different options there, and I don't think we have a full understanding of just the extent of this challenge in India, but this is something that would need to happen in order to achieve that target. Now, greenhouse gas and sustainability frameworks, it's not as much of a technical target, but when growing biofuels, we want to make sure that they're produced sustainably and are achieving greenhouse gas reductions to the highest extent possible. In a number of other countries, the United States, Brazil, the European Union, as they expanded biofuels, they started to run into these questions around, are these sustainable? To what degree are we actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And those types of frameworks are best to put in as you're starting to grow your production to make sure that those facilities that are built are using the best technology, or maybe using feedstocks that are more likely to stay in that sustainable range. Now, India is aware of these different issues. Greenhouse gas emission reductions from biofuels are estimated around 19 million tons. The India Ethanol Roadmap that was released also notes potential issues with water-intensive crops and the need to supplement sugarcane. Some of the incentives as well provide for a variety of different feedstocks, so to not just rely on sugarcane. But these types of frameworks can really help support that growth to ensure you don't run into some barrier later on. The other question that's raised quite a bit is around feedstock availability. But where are these fuels going to come from? What are the feedstocks that are going to be used to produce the ethanol to achieve that target? So what you're looking at here is, this is using some information from the Indian government as well as the OECD for an agricultural outlook. Right now, this light green part, this is existing sugars that are going to ethanol production, which is most of ethanol production in India. There's a range of surplus sugars as well that could be used to produce ethanol. We also have damaged grains, surplus rice, and then also maize. Now, if we put in this red line, which is the ethanol demand, you can see it uses a considerable amount of these surplus feedstocks. It would use all of the available surplus sugar and all of the available damaged grains, and would have to use some of the other ones. But you don't want to use just one, like any individual feedstock, because not all of this is going to be available all of the time. There's different levels of production, and as you start to use what is termed a surplus, the more you use it, it stops becoming a surplus, and so prices can start to increase as well. So this idea of using a flexible set of feedstocks, or ensuring that the ethanol is produced from a range of different feedstocks, can help kind of mitigate this feedstock availability issue. Advanced fuels are another option that would use a different set of feedstocks, such as waste and residues, and so you're not competing for these different sources. Often in India, this is referred as second generation ethanol production, so that's something else that could help mitigate this issue. And the final point is long-term policy support. So India has an excellent set of policies in place right now. I mean, this is what's helped drive demand to where it is today, that support new plants being produced, that provide incentives for the fuels themselves to be produced. There's the target, to set a clear target of where they're heading, as well as the Indian roadmap to kind of outline the different elements that need to happen. Now, India is currently guaranteeing fixed rates for ethanol, and those will need to also modify as prices change. And India has shown a willingness to do that. Incentives were just changed in November with small increases, 1% to 2%, to stay in line with price changes. But these things will need to continue to adapt over that 5-year period, and then extending beyond that 5-year period in order to maintain that production. So I've gone through a lot of different material. Some of the key takeaways for me are, one, looking at COP26 ambitions. It keeps the door open to a net zero pathway, and that net zero pathway can be facilitated through ethanol if it's produced in a way that helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and starts to look at these different sources of feedstock. But the world is not on track to meet that ambition right now, either in volumes or incorporating carbon capture and new feedstocks. But the world's not on track. India's growth is significant to become the third largest ethanol consumer in the world. But reaching that target, a 20% ethanol blending target, is going to require a number of things to happen, including new capacity to come online, double the capacity, compatible vehicles, greenhouse gas and sustainability frameworks, consistent feedstock supply, and ongoing policy support. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, and thank you very much for following me through that. Looking forward to some of your questions.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was really interesting, and I really did like your interactive slides. They really did popped out the the targets and kind of the message, right, of where we are in terms of capacity and availability and meeting the goals. And I am happy to see that we've got some questions, but let me start off with kind of a general comment, because I think you're absolutely right, and you kind of hit it on the head on. I was reading a recent article on, if we were to look at all of the global commitments for achieving net zero, I think with all the pledges that we have available right now, I think it's something like 70 to maybe 80% of global gas emissions would be covered with just the amount of pledges that have come online. But as you mentioned, we're nowhere near the implementation phase, or we're out of scope on projects that address that. And so, as we're having these different conversations around, well, how do we implement that? Do you know of a model that is available out there in terms of benchmarking the scope of types of work that could be done, that you can think of at the top of your head?
When you're thinking in this question around these net zero targets, or specifically on biofuels, the different policies that are
On both, as a matter of fact.
right. So one element you can look at. So the IEA produces a tracking report that looks at all the different clean energy technologies that can be used to facilitate the clean energy transition, and it looks at where they are today versus where they would need to be, and then also provides policy recommendations and examples of the types of policies that can support those technologies. So that's a good place to start, I think, because regardless of what your interest area is, there's something there to look at. Biofuels are provided there as well. There's a section on that, and also a section on aviation.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And I'm glad that you mentioned policy, because I think that's always the crux, and we've certainly seen, a type of policy being mandates, like the higher ethanol blend mandates that we're starting to see crop up in different countries, and that we're really glad to see is being promoted and encouraged and supported by the government of India to come to India. And so policy will definitely play a key role in this. But let's start addressing some of the questions. So the first question that we have is, U.S. has a carbon capture infrastructure and investment and a net zero commitment for 2030. India has set a target for 2070. What are the kind of investments needed to achieve a net zero in India?
Right. So net zero in India. So you can look. The IEA has also produced a net zero energy roadmap for India that is hundreds of pages that covers this question. So I can hit some of the key points. But it's a combination of lots of different technologies. It's a mix of energy efficiency that applies for transportation, industry, and buildings. And then you also want to look at where the energy sources are coming from. So India has very significant renewable energy targets, and so investments in renewable energy for electricity, like wind and solar and hydro, are critical to achieving that target. And then the end uses that link to that electricity. So that could be electric vehicles, that can be helping to electrify heat and those types of things. On the bioenergy side, biogas has a very big role to play, not just for providing electricity, but also for providing access to cooking across communities in India, and then biofuel investments as well. So what I went through on biofuels, as well as biogas and transport, which I didn't discuss a lot of, but India also has targets and expanding biogas that's used in transportation as well. So it's really this combination of measures that helps to achieve net zero.
Yeah. And I just want to remind our audience, on the handout section on the left-hand side of the screen, you will be able to find some of the information and some of the reports that Jeremy mentioned during his presentation. So the IEA Net Zero by 2050, World Energy Outlook, and the Renewables 2021 Data Explorer. You will also see Renewables 2021 Analysis and Forecast to 2026. So there's some material already available to you here. Can you please comment on HVO biodiesel and companies that provide plants for HVO biodiesel?
Sure. So renewable diesel, HVO, depends where you are in the world, the way, which terminology you use, but those are interchangeable. The presentation I use, renewable diesel. So a lot of growth projected for renewable diesel. There's a lot of interest in it. There's a lot of different companies that are playing the space. I mean, in Singapore, Neste has a large facility there, which is planning to expand. So that's one of the key companies in that space. We're also seeing a lot of oil and gas companies start to invest in renewable diesel. So Shell and Total are also planning new facilities, Marathon Petroleum. There's a long list of companies that are producing renewable diesel and expanding their production.
Right. Thank you. Do you think it is sustainable for India to produce all that ethanol it needs to meet the 20% target? This is going to be predominantly from sugarcane and maybe other food grains grown in areas that are already facing water issues. 2G ethanol, which is currently too expensive, but even if it was financed, comes with its own challenges. Biomass residue supply chain issues considering India's small farms. Is the 20% blending target really worth chasing?
So that's the question, right? And what I've laid out are some of the conditions that would need to be met in order to meet it. I don't have the answer on the sustainable component. I mean, the facilities aren't built yet. We don't know which feedstocks are being used. But I think that question, setting up those frameworks as we're developing growth in ethanol, that's the key piece to ensure that as it grows, those guardrails are in place,
Right.
and so that's less of a question and more of a guarantee of the program.
Right.
So I know that may not be it as direct an answer as you'd like. This is Ramia, but that's the big question, and the only way to really deal with it is to do the assessments and then set up those frameworks to prevent those negative impacts.
Yeah. But I'd like to also to add to your answer there. Yeah, 2G ethanol may be something to continue to pursue, but I always talk about, and I like to talk about the benefit of 1G ethanol production, which India is a major producer of. The U.S. is a producer of, and so is Brazil, for that matter. The technology that we have right now in ethanol capacity, we know and we understand what some of the benefits associated with higher ethanol blends with the current technology are. We're seeing corn ethanol has a 46% reduction in emissions capacity. It may not be across the entire country, but it is in particular states, and so we are seeing that ethanol continues to be the low-hanging fruit as we continue to pursue some of the other pathways that you described, whether it's wind and solar or electricity. We already have a technology that works. And so to answer the question on, is it really worth chasing? Absolutely. We have not yet seen a detraction from investing in higher ethanol blends. There are challenges, but we haven't really seen a detriment, I would say. So just adding my 2 cents on that one. Our next question, thanks for your presentation. In terms of 20% biofuels blending with fossil fuels, is it possible to replace directly with current vehicle systems?
Right. So this is the vehicle compatibility issue that I was raising. The vehicle fleet in India is diverse, so that answer is going to be very different for different vehicles. And India is working on a study right now to figure out exactly what that means for different vehicle classes. So for some vehicles, and what we're seeing right now, the answer is maybe not for 20%, maybe 10% is going to be acceptable. Other vehicles may be able to handle up to 20%. Based on the outcomes of that study, then that will help figure out, well, how do you still achieve 20% or not? I mean, maybe it's higher blending for some vehicles in some regions, lower in others, or maybe it is, well, we can do 20% more broadly across the country. So a standing question, but the potential exists to do it. Other countries have done it, so
Right.
it is possible.
Yeah, and I think that it becomes also a matter of progression, right? We heard Mr. Banerjee on our last series talk about the the plan to transition to, with compatibility is not going to be an overnight situation. It's going to definitely be a measured, stepped out or phased out process to ensure that it's a smooth transition. So I would say I think it is within the realms of possibility as long as it's phased out and allowed to be tested and tried. Um, Next question: do you think biodiesel industry could compete with HVO industry?
Right. I mean, not a direct response here. It depends on the market in different places. We're seeing, especially if you're in an area where the blending limits of biodiesel have already been met, or there's stated requirements for a limit on biodiesel blending, renewable diesel can go past that, and so it can outcompete biodiesel. But a lot of the existing production stays online. But a lot of the new production that we're seeing is coming from renewable diesel. It depends on the
Mhm.
country. In Indonesia, there's discussion of some new renewable diesel plants, but they're also building a lot of new biodiesel, and then the same in Brazil. So different answers depending on different markets and the types of policies in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Another question that we have is, what are the trade-offs between electrification and biofuel use?
The trade-offs between electrification and biofuels use. Um, so there's different pieces here. I mean, the primary, so let's start with this. On a net zero pathway, you do both. You electrify as much as you can, but you still need biofuels. And there's different components to that. And one of them, if we look today, the majority of vehicles are still using fossil fuels, and biofuels can be blended with the existing fleet of vehicles. And even as we electrify, even at very high rates, you still have vehicles that are running on biofuels. So they move together. As we go further into the future, and there's different views on the extent that electric vehicles grow or not, there's segments that are tougher to electrify or tougher to use hydrogen in, such as aviation and long haul trucking. And so in those areas, biofuels can continue to play a role even as we get to 2040 or 2050. And that's what we see in our net zero work. For the aviation sector, biojet continues to play a very large role out to 2050.
Yeah.
And we still see a lot of use in trucking. Where there's a lot more direct competition is in that gasoline market as we get out to 2040 and 2050. But
Yeah.
as you saw in the slides earlier, even then there's still a considerable amount of ethanol used in
Yeah.
that segment out to 2050.
Yeah. And to kind of add to that, there's the latest OPEC report on transportation. Is still showing a pretty significant gap between electrified vehicles, which are obviously coming into the future, are going to represent something like 25% of the entire transportation fleet, even in
Yeah.
2050. Where the majority of the fleet is still going to be combustion engines. And so I think that's something that we continue to face, as an industry. Cars themselves are not going to go away, and electrification is going to go somewhat hand in hand, but certainly combustion engines are not going to be phased out necessarily. So, that's something that we're going to have to wrestle with for a very long time, it seems. Um, Next question from the audience: can you name companies that can provide the plant for HVO diesel if someone is planning to start a new project of HVO biodiesel production, if you know of any?
Sure. So those are some of the companies like Neste, which I'd mentioned, and some of the large oil and gas companies, Total, Marathon. I mean, specifically in India, I don't know the companies as well in India, but those are some of the large international companies that work on renewable diesel projects.
Yeah, thank you. And we can see if we can create a list and have it available as well.
Sure.
Um, Kind of switching a little bit in going back to compatibility, we have a question regarding if one has to introduce flex fuel vehicles up to say 80%, What changes are to be made in a vehicle to meet existing norms like BS6, for example?
So your guest on the last presentation would have been the best one to answer this, and I don't have to answer the question.
Yeah.
But look at NREL, the NREL report from the last presentation provided a detailed breakdown of all the vehicle classifications, what needs to change, or the status of current vehicles, compatibility levels, and flex fuel vehicles. So you'll find that information there. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the report name as well. I don't know if you remember it, Alejandra.
Yeah, the compatibility study. So we can definitely float that around as well. EVs and clean energy will need to go hand in hand. With coal still a major raw material, where do you think this is leading to?
Yeah, I mean, with EVs, well, what we're seeing is an increasing deployment of renewable energy. So grids are getting cleaner around the world, and that means that electric vehicles are getting cleaner around the world. So that's where I see that heading. Most investments are happening in sources that have lower carbon intensities, and so electric vehicles do get cleaner over time on those grids. So that's the path that we're on right now.
Yeah. I want to go back to the feedstock because you did mention, and that is something that we're seeing certainly within the framework of the India ethanol roadmap of diversifying the feedstock available. But so since 2G is a while away, which feedstocks do you think are less carbon intensive?
Right. And it's the feedstock, but it's also the processes and the energy used at the facilities and how they're operated. So it's more than just which feedstock. So what I would direct you to for that one, there's different resources for this, but California's low carbon fuel standard tracks hundreds of different pathways for ethanol with very significant ranges. Some of those facilities, if you're combining with carbon capture and storage, you're getting to near zero, maybe even negative in some situations. And then on the other hand, you can have some supplies that maybe are using more carbon intensive energy sources, which are 20 or 30% from gasoline. So there's a huge range that's out there. So it depends on a whole number of factors. So I think it's more important to look at the facility as a whole as opposed to just a feedstock answer.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jeremy. I don't know that we have any other questions. However, I wanted to just hear your final comments, on as we embark on, a new year, and certainly energy transition, net zero, GHG emissions but they are kind of the buzzwords, what are kind of your parting thoughts on, where do we start? We talked about policy, we talked about pathways and benchmarks. What are your thoughts around that as in we start the new calendar year?
So when we're looking at, I'll start with net zero. So we have these increasing commitments to net zero. If a government's then trying to put in the policies to achieve it, greenhouse gas emissions are going to be a key factor in that policy design. And what we see when governments do that for transportation fuels is you end up with things like the low carbon fuel standard or the clean fuel standard in Canada, the new renewable energy directive across Europe that have carbon intensity requirements. The same in Brazil. We also know as we start to accelerate biofuels at the scale that I'm showing, you're right to point out a lot of the production today, we don't see all the different types of impacts that people are maybe concerned about. But when we look at the scale of growth in these scenarios, those sustainability frameworks are critical to providing those guardrails to allow for that growth to happen. And so that's my parting message. As with net zero and these considerations for other to mitigate other environmental issues, you're going to increasingly see policies that have greenhouse gas as the central focus, and then some sort of sustainability framework to ensure that as you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you're not causing some other harm somewhere else. And that's the trend with this policy design. And in response, there's plenty of room for conventional fuels, which I'd showed. but there are limits to how far you can grow conventional fuels. So we need investment into those next set of technologies if biofuels will play the role as we've shown here.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jeremy. And actually, I misspoke. We have two more questions that I didn't address.
No
So
more
if
questions.
we still have a little bit
Okay.
of time. Uh, Brazil uses minimum 20% ethanol, 27% ethanol containing gasoline. All
Right.
vehicles use this, though many may not be originally designed for this. Any thoughts on this?
Any thoughts? So the numbers that I've seen for Brazil, when in the 90s, well, it dates even further back than that, had an intentional plan to ensure that vehicles could be compatible with ethanol. 80% of the fleet are flex fuel vehicles. So the vast majority of vehicles can handle that level of blends. And so this was intentional government policy to make sure that the vehicle fleet could be compatible with those levels. Now, of that remaining 20% of vehicles, I'm not sure on the breakdown of that, but I would expect that they're compatible with higher blends, and the vehicles being sold in the market are designed for that.
Right. And again, I think we go back to policy, right?
Right.
To ensuring that the policy framework is amenable and is compatible, to use the industry term, to make this be a reality. And kind of going hand in hand with that, and going back to electrification, what is your opinion about 100% electrification vehicle target in the automobile sector compared to alternative fuel scenarios? And you kind of touched on this on your parting thoughts, that
Right.
there's going to be a limit, but any additional thoughts on that?
So bring it back. I mean, bring it back. The aim is net zero. We're trying to reduce emissions, and every country is going to think through different ways to do that. And it's going to be different for different segments in transportation. And so if the country wants to target 100% electric vehicles as part of a net zero pathway and they feel that's feasible, no issue with that. Each government can kind of take its own approach. There's going to be others that may continue to support biofuels or other fuels like hydrogen in the transportation sector. So there's going to be a number of different approaches. What we're seeing overall, though, is that you require all of those solutions in order to get to net zero. We don't have any scenario that only does electric vehicles or only does hydrogen or only does biofuels. All of them are needed on this pathway.
Right. Perfect. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for your participation today, and giving us your thoughts and your insights into this very interesting topic. I'm sure that we will continue to talk about this particular topic into 2022 and further, as we must. I am excited and very hopeful as I see more interest, more government policies, and policymakers becoming more involved and more engaged, and including industry, including different stakeholders that can add value to the discussion. That's a very interesting dynamic that we're seeing, and one that we certainly hope continues to grow to the next year. So thank you very much, Jeremy, for joining us today, and appreciate your presentation.
Thank you to you as well,
Have a
and
good
for
one.
everyone on the line who joined.
Thank you, everyone, for your thoughts and your questions, and we'll see you next month for our fourth ethanol series. We'll be sending you more information later on. Have a good night, good morning, and good evening.